Richard stood atop the crumbling facade of what used to be Oxford's city library, surveying the desolation that stretched before him. The city, once alive with the laughter of children and the hustle of daily life, now lay silent, a grave to millions who once called it home. The war against the People's Republic had reduced Oxford to a skeleton of its former self, buildings gutted by firefights, streets cratered from bombings. It was hard to imagine that just a few years ago, he had dreamed of visiting the city's famous carnival, a vibrant festival that had drawn families from across the planet. The carnival, Richard remembered, was the first to be bombed in the surprise attack by the People's Republic. The news had shown images of the colorful tents ablaze, the Ferris wheel twisted grotesquely by the heat. Families, just there for a day of joy, obliterated in an instant. It was that day Richard's resolve had hardened, the day he decided to join the fight, not just for his homeworld, but for the memory of those innocent lives lost. Now as he stood watch, the memory of those images fused with the reality around him. Oxford was a ghost city, its soul ripped out, echoing with the phantoms of those who had perished. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the acrid smell of spent ammunition, a constant reminder of the ongoing struggle for survival. Beside him, his lifelong best friend Mark shifted uneasily, the weight of their upcoming mission pressing heavily upon him. They had joined the war together, inseparable since childhood, their bond strengthened by the chaos that surrounded them. But as the battle for Oxford loomed, Richard could see the toll it was taking on Mark, the shadow of fear in his eyes that mirrored his own. The plan, a citywide charge to push the People's Republic forces out into the open fields beyond Oxford, was audacious. Command believed it could turn the tide of the war, routing the enemy in a decisive blow. Richard wanted to believe it too, to think that their sacrifices could lead to something resembling victory. But as he looked out over the ruins of Oxford, doubt crept in. Could this really be the end they were fighting for? The night before the charge was restless, filled with the low murmur of soldiers preparing for battle. Weapons were checked and rechecked, letters written to loved ones, and silent prayers offered to whatever gods might be listening. Richard and Mark sat together in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the unspoken fear of what the next day might bring hanging between them. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, Richard knew there was no turning back. The charge would go forward, and they along with it, for Oxford, for their lost families, for the future of their homeworld. The ghost city was about to awaken, and Richard could only hope they were ready for what was to come. The morning sun barely pierced the smog-filled skies of Oxford, its light diffused into a bleak, gray haze that mirrored the mood among the soldiers. Richard and his comrades, a ragtag assembly of volunteers, conscripts, and veterans, gathered in the shadow of a collapsed skyscraper that had once been a beacon of the city's prosperity. Now, it served as a grim reminder of the cost of resistance. The commander, a grizzled veteran named Colonel Harris, paced before the assembled troops. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the morning chill with an intensity that demanded attention. He began, "We take back Oxford, not with hope or prayers, but with action. We will charge the enemy lines, push them out into the open fields beyond, where we have the advantage." Richard listened, his gaze fixed on the map displayed on a cracked digital screen. The plan was clear, marked in bold lines that crisscrossed the city. Each route converged on the eastern sector, where intelligence suggested the People's Republic forces were weakest. It was a plan born of desperation, a Hail Mary that staked everything on the element of surprise and the sheer audacity of their assault. Beside him, Mark leaned in, whispering, "You think this will work?" Richard glanced at his friend, the uncertainty in Mark's eyes a reflection of his own doubts. "It has to," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Colonel Harris continued, outlining the specifics of the operation. Diversionary attacks would commence at dawn, drawing the enemy's attention and resources away from the main thrust. Meanwhile, Richard, Mark, and their unit were to spearhead the charge, breaking through the Republic's defenses and creating an opening for the rest of the forces to exploit. The plan was met with a mix of grim acceptance and determined resolve. For many, like Richard and Mark, the battle for Oxford was personal. They were not just fighting for strategic objectives, but for redemption, for the chance to reclaim a piece of their shattered lives. As the briefing concluded, the troops dispersed, moving to their starting positions. Richard and Mark found themselves alone for a moment, the chaos of preparation swirling around them. "We've got one shot at this," Mark Richard said, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "Let's make it count." Mark nodded, a tight smile breaking through his apprehension. "For Oxford," he replied, the words a shared vow between them. The city braced itself for the coming storm, the silence of the early morning a stark contrast to the violence that would soon engulf its streets. Richard checked his equipment one last time, his thoughts drifting to the carnival that had once brought joy to this place. It was for those lost moments of happiness, for the lives cut short, that he was fighting. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the ruins of Oxford, Richard and his comrades prepared to charge into the unknown. The plan of desperation was about to unfold, a final gamble for freedom in the face of overwhelming odds. The night draped itself over Oxford like a shroud, the once vibrant city now reduced to a shadowy maze of ruins and memories. Soldiers hunkered down in their makeshift encampments, the eve of battle pressing down on them with an almost physical weight. Among them, Richard and Mark found a quiet corner, a brief respite amid the storm of preparation. The air was thick with anticipation and the undercurrent of fear that accompanies the unknown. This was the night before the reckoning, the final quiet before the chaos of war would once again tear through the heart of Oxford. Mark broke the silence first, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. "Remember when we were kids, Richie? You always talked about seeing the carnival here, said it was your dream." Richard smiled faintly, the memory bittersweet. "Yeah, seems like another lifetime now." The carnival, with its lights and laughter, was a stark contrast to the grim reality they faced. Yet in that moment it served as a poignant reminder of why they fought not just for survival, but for the return of such simple joys to their world. The conversation shifted, as it often did on the eve of battle, to reflections on their journey. From childhood friends to comrades in arms, their bond had only deepened in the trenches. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Mark said, a note of pride mingling with the apprehension in his voice. "We have," Richard agreed, clapping his friend on the back. "And after tomorrow we'll have come even further. We'll push them back, Mark. We have to." Their resolve was a flickering flame in the night, bolstered by shared memories and the unspoken understanding that the dawn would bring a trial like none they had faced before. They spoke of plans for the future, of hopes pinned on the slim chance of victory, knowing well that not all would live to see those dreams realized. As the night deepened, they joined their fellow soldiers, the camaraderie a small comfort against the looming specter of war. Laughter and stories flowed, a temporary balm to soothe the nerves and steel the spirit. Yet beneath it all was the unshakable knowledge of the morrow's charge, a specter that hung over every smile and echoed in every word. Finally, as the first hints of gray touched the eastern sky, signaling the approach of dawn, Richard and Mark, along with their unit, gathered their gear. Their faces were masks of resolve, set and determined, as they prepared to face what lay ahead. Richard took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, trying to quell the rising tide of anxiety within him. Beside him, Mark met his gaze, an unspoken promise exchanged between them. They were ready as they could ever be, for the battle that awaited. The city of Oxford, with its ghosts and ruins, stood silent witness as the soldiers readied themselves for the charge. It was a moment suspended in time, the calm before the storm, before the echoes of their footsteps would join the chorus of history's great struggles. And as the first light of dawn began to spill over the horizon, Richard, Mark, and their comrades stepped forward into destiny, their hearts heavy with the weight of what was to come, but unyielding in their determination to reclaim their home. Dawn broke over Oxford with a crimson hue, painting the ruins in shades of blood and fire, a foreboding canvas for the day's battle. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, a relentless drum echoing the nervous energy that coursed through the assembled soldiers. Beside him, Mark's face was set, a grim determination etched into his youthful features. The signal came, a simple flare that pierced the morning sky, its bright arc a silent command that unleashed chaos. With a collective roar, Richard, Mark, and their comrades surged forward, a human tide crashing against the remnants of Oxford's once proud architecture. The initial moments were a blur of adrenaline-fueled frenzy. Richard's training took over, each movement precise, each decision instinctive. Around him, the city came alive with the sounds of war, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of men, the whine of drones overhead. But the People's Republic was ready. Their counterattack was swift, brutal. Gunfire rained from fortified positions, cutting swathes through the charging troops. Explosions tore through the advancing lines, sending men flying, their cries lost amidst the cacophony of battle. Richard found himself ducking behind a shattered wall, Mark at his side. They exchanged a look, a wordless communication honed by years of friendship. This was not the sweeping victory they had envisioned, it was a grinder. Each inch gained paid for in blood. The charge faltered, the momentum lost amid heavy casualties. Richard and his unit, trapped in the open and pinned down by enemy fire, fought desperately for survival. The dream of pushing the Republic's forces into the open fields beyond Oxford evaporated like mist under the unforgiving sun. As the hours bled away, the battle's tide turned irrevocably against them. Richard watched in horror as friends and comrades fell, the air thick with dust and despair. And then, amidst the chaos, a moment that would forever haunt him, Mark, stepping forward to cover their retreat, was struck down. Time seemed to stop. Richard rushed to his friend's side, ignoring the danger, the world narrowing to the fallen form of his lifelong companion. Mark's eyes met his, a flicker of pain and resignation passing between them before the light faded from his gaze. The retreat was sounded, a bitter, ragged withdrawal that saw the remnants of their forces pull back to the dubious safety of the ruins. Richard, carrying Mark's body, refused to leave his friend behind, a silent vow made amid the echoing gunfire and the cries of the wounded. The day ended not with victory, but with defeat. The citywide charge, meant to be a decisive blow against the People's Republic, had failed. The cost was etched in the faces of the survivors, and the tears and blood that stained the broken streets of Oxford. As night fell, Richard sat among the ruins, Mark beside him, the silence a stark contrast to the day's fury. The loss was overwhelming, a grief that consumed the flames of anger and defiance, leaving behind only ash. The battle for Oxford was over, but the war raged on. And for Richard, the fight had become something more personal, a crusade not just for his homeworld, but for the memory of the friend he had lost. In the depths of despair, he questioned the cause for which they fought, the price of their resistance against an enemy that seemed invincible. But there was no time for reflection, no respite for the weary. The People's Republic, unsatisfied with the day's bloodshed, began their bombardment, a relentless barrage that sought to erase even the memory of resistance. As shells rained down and bombers filled the sky, Richard's world narrowed to survival, each explosion a reminder of the fragility of life and the inexorable advance of war. And in that moment, as the world seemed to crumble around him, Richard's resolve faced its ultimate test, the future uncertain, his survival hanging by a thread in the war-torn ruins of Oxford. Under the cloak of darkness, Oxford's ruins smoldered, a testament to the day's brutal conflict. Richard, his uniform stained with the blood of fallen comrades, cradled Mark's lifeless form, the silence around him punctuated by distant explosions and the sporadic crackle of flames consuming what remained of the city. The failed charge had decimated their ranks, the dream of routing the People's Republic crushed under the weight of cold reality. The remnants of their unit regrouped in the shadow of a collapsed building, the hollow eyes of the survivors reflecting a shared desolation. They were no longer an army, but a band of broken men, haunted by loss and the specter of defeat. The plan that had promised hope had delivered them into a nightmare, the cost written in the lives of friends and the ruins of Oxford. As the night deepened, Whispers of retreat began to circulate among the survivors. There was no shame in their voices, only the harsh acceptance of their situation. They were outmatched, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. The People's Republic had not just held Oxford, they had tightened their grip, a noose around the neck of the resistance. Richard listened, Mark's dog tags clenched in his fist, a tangible connection to the brother in arms he had lost. The reality of command weighed heavily upon him. The decisions of leaders leading to the bloodshed of the innocent. In the face of overwhelming odds, what was the path forward? Retreat and regroup, or stand and fight on hallowed ground soaked in the blood of their brethren? The decision was made with the first light of dawn. Under the cover of darkness, Richard led the survivors away from Oxford, a strategic withdrawal to fight another day. But with each step, the burden of failure and the guilt of leaving behind the city and the dead weighed heavily on his heart. The journey through the night was a silent march of ghosts, the once vibrant city now a graveyard of dreams. Oxford had been their last stand, a line drawn in the sand, and they had been pushed back, the enemy too strong, too prepared. As they reached the relative safety of the surrounding countryside, the first rays of dawn revealing the extent of their loss, Richard allowed himself a moment of grief. Mark, his childhood friend, the constant in a life upended by war, was gone. The pain of that loss, raw and unyielding, threatened to consume him. But there was no time for mourning, not with the enemy pressing their advantage. The sound of distant artillery, a harbinger of the People's Republic's relentless pursuit, spurred them on. The battle for Oxford might have ended, but the war for their homeworld continued. In the solitude of the pre-dawn light, Richard grappled with the enormity of their defeat. The charge had been a gamble, a bid for freedom that had ended in tragedy. The cost of their resistance, once a price they were willing to pay, now seemed an insurmountable debt. And as the first artillery shells of the new day fell, signaling the beginning of the Republic's bombardment, Richard's despair deepened. The war was far from over, and yet, in that moment, the fight seemed futile. With every explosion, every loss, the question loomed larger: was the fight worth the cost? The retreat brought no solace to Richard, nor to the weary soldiers who trudged alongside him through the dense underbrush that bordered Oxford. The city, once a beacon of culture and history, now lay in ruins, its silhouette a jagged wound against the dawn sky. But it wasn't the loss of buildings or streets that weighed most heavily on Richard's heart. It was the loss of Mark, his lifelong friend, whose absence felt like a void no victory could ever fill. In the relative safety of a secluded woodland, far enough from the immediate threat of the People's Republic's artillery, the survivors paused. Exhausted bodies collapsed onto the forest floor, but rest evaded Richard. In his hands he held the tags that had once hung proudly around Mark's neck, their cold metal a cruel reminder of the warmth of the friend he'd lost. Guilt gnawed at him. Mark had joined the fight at his side, driven by loyalty and the naive belief that together they could make a difference. Now Richard questioned the cause they had fought for, the price of their rebellion, and whether it was worth the cost of lives like Mark's. The forest around them was a tapestry of shadows and whispers, the sounds of nature a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Here, in this moment of quiet, Richard allowed himself to grieve. Tears, unbidden, traced paths down his dirt-streaked face, each one a testament to the pain and the profound sense of loss. His comrades respected his sorrow, offering space for his mourning while grappling with their own demons. The bond of soldiers, forged in the heat of battle, was strong, but the pain of loss was a chasm that often yawned wide and deep. As the day waned, Richard found himself recounting stories of Mark to anyone who would listen. Tales of childhood adventures, of dreams shared beneath starlit skies, and of promises made. With each word, Mark's memory was kept alive, a bittersweet comfort amid the raw ache of his absence. But grief was a luxury they could ill afford. The distant rumble of artillery, like thunder on the horizon, served as a grim reminder that the war raged on. Richard knew they would soon need to move, to rejoin the fight, but how could he lead without Mark by his side? How could he face the battle lines knowing each command might send another mark into the void? As night fell, wrapping the woodland in darkness, Richard's resolve wavered. The loss of his friend had shattered something within him, a fracture that ran deep, questioning the very essence of their struggle. Was their fight against the People's Republic worth the river of blood it demanded? Could freedom ever truly be won, or was it just an ideal, as elusive as the peace they so desperately sought? In the aftermath of their harrowing retreat and the loss of Mark, Richard found himself leading what remained of their unit through the dense forest that bordered Oxford, away from the immediate grasp of the People's Republic. The foliage, once a vibrant testament to the planet's beauty, now seemed to mock them with its tranquility, untouched by the horrors of war that ravaged the land beyond its borders. Under the canopy of ancient trees, Richard grappled with a turmoil that ran deeper than the physical wounds of battle. The ideals that had once fueled his resolve, the belief in a liberated homeworld, free from the tyranny of the People's Republic, now flickered dimly, obscured by grief and the stark reality of their situation. The war had taken much from Richard, but the loss of Mark, a friend who had been as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, had torn away a piece of his soul. In the quiet moments between the forced marches and the planning of their next move, Richard's thoughts invariably turned to the futility of their struggle. Was their sacrifice making a difference, or were they merely cogs in a machine of endless conflict, destined to be ground down until nothing remained? As the unit made camp for the night, Richard sat apart, his gaze lost to the flickering flames of their fire. The faces of his comrades, illuminated by the dance of light and shadow, bore the scars of war, each telling a story of loss and resilience. They looked to him for leadership, for the strength to continue fighting in the face of overwhelming odds. But where they saw a leader, Richard saw only a man haunted by doubt and the echoing question, was it worth it? The People's Republic's advance was relentless, their superior numbers and firepower a constant shadow over their efforts to regroup and resist. The news from other fronts, brought by scouts and the occasional radio transmission, spoke of similar defeats, of valiant stands that ended in bloodshed and retreat. The enormity of their enemies' might, set against the backdrop of their own dwindling resources and morale, painted a grim picture of the war's possible outcome. In the depths of the night, Richard wrestled with the path ahead. The weight of command, the responsibility for the lives of his men, bore down on him with a crushing intensity. Each decision, each order he gave, carried the potential for more loss, more grief. How many more marks would this war claim before peace was won, if peace was even possible? The dawn that greeted Richard and his beleaguered unit was one of ominous portent. The forest, which had offered a semblance of sanctuary, now felt like a cage as the distant rumble of People's Republic artillery grew ever closer. The war, it seemed, was unwilling to grant them even a moment's respite. Richard's mind was a whirlwind of conflict and sorrow. The loss of Mark had hollowed him out, leaving a void where once there had been an unshakable resolve. The faces of his comrades, etched with fatigue and the scars of battle, looked to him for orders, for a plan to evade the encroaching doom heralded by the Republic's advance. But as Richard prepared to rally his unit for what might be their final march, the forest around them erupted in violence. Artillery shells, their whistles harbingers of destruction, fell like rain, tearing through the canopy, transforming trees into splinters, earth into craters. The air filled with the screams of men, the concussive blasts of the bombardment, and the rending of nature itself. In the chaos, Richard found himself knocked to the ground, debris and dirt showering over him. Disoriented, he scrambled to his feet, desperate to account for his unit amidst the smoke and chaos. His heart raced, not just with fear, but with an overwhelming sense of failure. This was not the end he had envisioned, not the stand he had hoped to make against the tyranny of the People's Republic. The bombardment intensified, a relentless assault that sought to obliterate not just the resistance fighters, but the very idea of resistance itself. Richard, caught in the maelstrom, ran through the inferno, dodging explosions, calling out for his comrades. The world had narrowed to survival, to the primal instinct to endure. But even as he fought to regroup, to salvage what he could from the devastation, Richard's thoughts were with Mark. His friend's laughter, his unwavering loyalty, the dreams they had shared, these memories became a beacon in the darkness, a reminder of why they fought. And yet the question that had haunted Richard since the loss of Oxford, since the moment Mark fell, gnawed him with renewed ferocity. Was their sacrifice worth it? Could any cause justify this horror? The answer was lost in the thunder of bombs, in the screams of the wounded, in the silence of those who would speak no more. As the bombardment continued, relentless and unyielding, Richard's resolve was tested as never before. The fight for freedom, for his homeworld, had brought him to this moment, to this precipice of despair and defiance. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please be sure to subscribe and leave a like. Feel free to check out either of the videos linked here as well.